Masechet Baba Batra, Daf Kof Samech Bet. We are continuing to analyze the laws of writing up legal documents. We saw in the previous daf that you are not allowed to erase the words Sharir v'Kayam. Those are key words in a document, and therefore, if there's enough space in the place where we expect those words, one is not allowed to erase those words. However, other parts of it you are allowed to erase. And so now we're going to learn a law about that. Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef Amar Rabbi Yochanan Kol mechakin kulan tzarich sheichtov v'den kiyumeho. Rabbi Yochanan teaches that anything that you erase, you have to write at the end of the document, and this is their verification. In other words, at the end of the document, you have to list and say, on line 5, I made a mistake and I erased a word, and instead I wrote in the word shalosh. And so you put that at the end of the document. That way, it won't be possible for someone to erase that word that the scribe actually put in. Let's say put shalosh in, is supposed to be, and then someone else will come and erase that word and put something else and put shesh. So we want to make sure that since there's an erasure, if it's something that's not erased, so you can see this is the original writing. Once something is erased, you can see that there's something rubbed out. And then we're afraid someone will erase the replacement of what was there. And so therefore, at the end of the document, you say, on line 4, a word was erased, and we put in this word instead, and that way, no one can tamper with it afterwards. That's the first law of Rabbi Yochanan. Second law, and also, you have to give a quick summary of the document on the last line. My tama, why? Why is it important to write a summary and not anything new on the last line? Amar Rav Amram, lefi she'en lemedim mishita acharona. Rav Amram explains, because we will not learn any new things from the final line. If you have a document that gives all everything, the buying, the selling, the price, it tells you everything, and then on the last line it says, and also you're going to give me $1 million, and you agree to that. We ignore that line. You can't add any new information on the last line. So that's why you should only put a summary of what was already said before. Amar Rav Nachman Rav Amram Mena lacha. So Rav Nachman asked Rav Amram, how do you know this? What's your source? What is the reason for it? Amar le Detanya, Hilchik et ha'edim shene shitim min haketa pasul, shita achat kasher. He says, I know from a baraita that says, if there's space between the witnesses and the text, you have the text of the document, and then the witnesses are signing on the bottom. Now, you shouldn't leave too much space between the end of the text and the witnesses. If there are 2 empty lines between, then the whole document is invalid. We're afraid someone's going to come and add more things into it, and then that will be invalid. So there can't be any space. But if there's only one line, then it's okay. That's the Braita. Now Rav Amram is going to explain. What's the difference between 2 lines and 1 line? Just like with 2 lines, aren't you afraid someone will add in more clauses? 1 line also, someone might add in some clause. For 2 lines, you're afraid someone will forge and write in some new details. 1 line also, you should be afraid of that. Rather, we can learn from here that here's the difference. With the last line of a text, we're not going to learn anything new from it. And that's why when you write the last line, don't put any new information. Just write a summary of what was there before. And then you put the witnesses. Whereas the second to last line, there you can add new things. That's why if there's too much space, 2 lines of space, then that's no good, because a person could add new information on the second to last line, and then anything else on the last line, and people will think that this is an original part of the document. So now we understand the law of Rabbi Yochanan, that you should always leave, don't put anything new on the last line, because we ignore the last line. Why do you ignore the last line? Because we're not going to require the witnesses that they sign immediately under the last line. It doesn't look nice. Usually you skip a line just to make it to make it look nice. So it's okay if the witnesses don't sign their name immediately right after, leaving no space at all from the last line of the text to their signatures. So it's expected that they're going to leave one line. Since they're going to leave one line, we're afraid someone's going to write a new clause in. So we make a rule: anything that's written on the last line, we ignore. We're not going to learn anything new from it. And therefore, you should write a summary on the last line. Don't write anything new on the last line because we're going to ignore it. If it's in the second to last line, then yes. And that's why 2 empty lines is no good. Ibayalehu question. Shital mechesa mai. What about 1.5 lines? We saw that 1 line, it's valid. 2 lines, it's invalid. How about 1.5? Tashema. Hirchiket aidim sheneshitim pasul hashita mechesa kasher. Let's learn from the Baraita that says, if you have 2 lines between the text and the witnesses, then it's invalid. That means 2 is invalid. Less than that, 1.5, sounds like the document is valid. Ema sefa. However, look at the continuation of that baraita. Shita achat kasher. That says 1 line is valid. If there's 1 empty space, then the document is valid. Shita chatu de kasher, hashita mechesa pasul. We can infer from that specifically 1 empty line makes it valid. But any more than that, 1.5, is no good. So now there's a contradiction between what we infer from the Resha and what we would infer from the Sefa. So we see that we cannot learn anything from this Baraita. This Baraita is not talking about that middle case. It's giving you 1, it's giving you 2. It's not being so precise to tell you 1.5, because you can learn opposite things if you try to make a diuk from either the first half or the second half. So this source is not helpful to us. So now what's the answer? Tashema detanya. We have another Baraita to the rescue that says if there's space from the text to the witnesses and the space is 2 lines, then it's no good. Anything less is okay. Now this is a good baraita. We see 2 specifically is the cutoff point, and anything less than 2, that's okay. So 1.5 lines, that's fine. Idea is that it would be hard to squeeze in 2 lines in the space of 1.5 lines. If someone would try to do that, they would have to write really small, and it would look off. So there's really, even in 1.5 space, there's only room to add 1 line of text, and we're going to ignore that last line of text in any case. So that's okay. היו 4 ו5 עדים חתומים על השטר, ונמצא אחד מהם קרוב או פסול, תתקיים העדות בשער. Now the Baraita continues and teaches us that if there are 4 or 5 witnesses that are signed on a document, for a regular document, you only need 2 witnesses. So this is as extra, 4 or 5. Sometimes people would put extra because they want to publicize the fact that they made this business deal. So you add more witnesses and then they go tell people about it. However, here's the problem. 1 of those 5 ends up being is a relative or is a gambler and is an invalid witness. So do we throw out the whole document? The answer is no. We can still ratify the document based on the other witnesses, right? Just ignore that one. As long as there's 2 kosher, valid witnesses, then the document is valid. This supports what Chizkiah said, because he taught that if you fill up the gap with other signatures, even if they're relatives, that's okay. So in other words, Chizkiah is giving you some good advice. Let's say you have a document and you wrote the document, and then the witnesses that signed, they signed lower down. So you know what? Just bring some relatives, fill in the middle space of the gap. Let's say it's 2 or 3 or 4 lines. So just put other signatures there, and then there's no gap, and then that will be okay. And the reason that's okay is two reasons. Number one, since there are signatures there, you can't add in any other text. So we're not afraid that someone's going to also add in, and you owe me $2 million, because the space is all filled up. And if you're going to say, well, I'm worried, but these are invalid witnesses, that's also okay, because as long as there's 2 valid witnesses, then even if the other ones are relatives, the document is still valid. Ve'al titma. Now Chizkiah says, don't be surprised at this. Shareh avir sukkah posel b'shlosha, sechach pasul posel be'arba'a. The reason why you might be surprised is because we just said that 2 empty lines makes the document no good. But invalid, two lines of false witnesses, that's okay. And so that's a strange thing. You would think that invalid witnesses would be worse, would make the document worse than empty space. Empty space is kind of neutral, and invalid witnesses sounds like it's a negative. So shouldn't it all the more so if 2 empty spaces are no good? Then shouldn't it be all the more so that invalid witnesses, 2 lines of invalid witnesses also should be no good? Chizkiah says, I'll give you an analogy. If you have in the schach empty space, let's say between the schach, there's a hole in the schach. As long as it's less than 3 tefachim, it's okay. We say lavud. We can make believe that the space is not even there, and the schach is kasher. That's if it's empty space. Whereas if it's schach pasul, let's say you have like a light that's made out of metal or some decoration made out of plastic, and it's up, on the schach, that is schach pasul. As long as it's less than 4 tefachim, that's okay. So here you see something interesting. Schach pasul, you might think, would make something more invalid than empty space. But he says that's not so. That's not the halacha. The halacha is that empty space actually is worse than schach pasul, because anything more than 3 tefachim of empty space, that's it. That's a hole, and now you can't sit under it. And let's say there's more than 3 tefachim of space between the edge of the schach and the wall. Well, then the schach is not considered even connected to the wall. The whole sukkah will be pasul. So you see, empty space is even worse than schach pasul, where the cutoff line is higher of 4 tefachim. And so that's the same thing is true regarding a document, that empty space, anything more, 2 spaces or more, was going to make it invalid. But as long as you fill it in, even if it's with invalid witnesses, that's okay, because you're not going to be able to forge it with adding extra text in the middle. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen ve'amen.